personal communication to include variant forms of writing, speech, sound, and image. So it moves away from the rational striving for consensus towards the affective and the playful, as well as elements such as witnessing and care. So in a way, to me, this seems like maybe a useful point to begin to think about the role of social media and some of the reasons behind people's use and the ways in which we can think maybe about publicness and about self-mediation via the use of things like Facebook and Twitter. Someone told me don't put long quotes on PowerPoints, but and this notion of self-mediated publicness questions dominant notions of citizenship as always being rooted in ends-oriented political action, instead in favor of a view of self-presentation, performance, and speaking out as fundamental citizen acts. And then, of course, I'm making a provocative statement in the next sentence, but it's just worth thinking about maybe. There is, of course, maybe an inherent contradiction within this conception of citizenship. While self-mediation allows for a wide variety of voices to be heard, it is at the same time an atomized and perhaps highly individualistic form of democratic expression. So this is also part of this classic techno-utopian, techno-dystopian debate. On the one hand, we are able to express our opinions and feelings about global political events, yet on the other hand, it's highly individualized, almost selfish form of communication. That's the critique from the other side. Schudson and Mark Deuse's work on monitorial citizenship, I think, also relates to this. So a useful conception of citizenship to link to self-mediated publicness and performance is that of the monitorial citizen, whereby citizens scan the informational environment for issues of interest, and where Habermasian information gathering and analysis is replaced by steady, if perhaps somewhat shallow, surveillance. Again, I think a sort of a good summary of some of the debates between the techno-utopians and the debunkers, the mode. In other words, techno-utopians are claiming that it's a way of scanning the environment, whereas the debunkers will say it's shallow, it's not deep, and it does not give the kind of engagement and involvement in the issue that's really necessary in terms of democratic discussion. And then the third area is the area that I worked on together with Mia Christensen, which is ephemeral communicative space. And the trigger for this particular idea was Turkey's winning of the Eurovision Song Contest a number of years back. And what happened was that after Turkey won the Eurovision Song Contest, a lot of discussion began. We saw a spike, another spike. And the spike in this case was a discussion of Turkish Europeanness, which happened after the victory. And what you saw was a large number of articles, a lot of discussion about, not about the Eurovision Song Contest, not about Turkey hosting the contest the next year, but about what does the victory mean for Turkey's place within Europe? What does it mean about Turkishness? What does it mean about being a Muslim country? And then there are discussions inside of Turkey about what does singing in English mean for Turkishness? Are we pandering to a European audience in order to curry favor with them? And so what we argued in this paper was that after this election, after this victory in the Eurovision Song Contest, as in the consequences of, for example, Orhan Pamuk's winning of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Turkey's getting to the semifinal of the World Cup, we saw similar spikes. In other words, we saw events that triggered a very short but intensive burst of debate, not necessarily about the event itself, but about all of the things that are encrusted around what it meant to be Turkish or what it meant to be a citizen of a particular country. So while there exists a variety of communicative spaces within which discursive debates take place in elongated time frames, emerge as extensions of these spaces where existing debates are expanded and intensified. To put it another way, the political cultural issues addressed inside a short-lived discursive space are superimposed on existing discourse, but dissolve within a short period of time, hence the ephemeral definition, with each intensive round adding a new layer of sediment to public debates and social imaginaries. So in other words, discussions about Turkishness or discussions about Iran are not always about Iran. They might be about American foreign policy. They might be about the ways we think about Islam. For example, in Egypt, if you're familiar with what happened, after the celebrations in the main square in Cairo after Mubarak resigned, a Western-based Australian US-based journalist was raped. And there was a lot of discussion about women's rights in the Middle East and about Islam and the mob rule and all of these things. In other words, the event itself caused a spike in discussion, but not necessarily about the piece or about the thing itself, but about all these other things encrusted around that issue. So we argue that it provides a tool for understanding mediated mechanisms that lead to the opening up of these realms. and I'm not going to speak too much more. I've got a few minutes left. But I think you get the point here that when you combine these three areas of monitorial citizenship and self-mediated publicness and ephemerality, some interesting issues sort of pop up. One might be to consider the relationship between what we're calling ephemeral communicative space and social media. You know, are social media particularly conducive to sort of participation in these very intensive bursts and rounds of discussion? So both technologically and sociologically, what are the connections? Secondly, social media events and political discourse and extensions of pre-existing debate and speech. So for the examples I gave, like about Turkey, when you have these events in Iran or in Egypt or in Libya or Iran or Belarus or wherever it might be, what is the kind of discussion that is taking place in these bursts? Are they always about the event themselves, or is it basically the superimposition of other longer-term discussions onto the event? And then when that event finishes, we move on to the next one, and then the next one. The democratization of primarily Muslim countries. For example, that's been a major discursive issue in all of these things going on in North Africa. And people are always pointing to Turkey, for example, as someone who lived in Turkey. Turkey is an example of a country, of a predominantly Muslim country that's a democracy. And then all of the discussions about that. How might the ephemeral, anonymous nature of the practice, often anonymous, we're not always aware of who's making these comments on Twitter, impact the capital of the Twitterer or tweeter, and thus the potential for influence? So as we look at these graphs of red and blue, and we talk about influence, I mean, influence takes the form maybe of retweets, but also informed in terms of the kind of debates or arguments that are being made. And also, finally, it's worth thinking about this relationship between the ephemeral space and what we might want to call the sort of global cosmopolitan citizen. In a lot of the discussions, not necessarily about users outside of the countries, but in users inside of Iran or in Egypt, there's a sort of presumption about who these people are using technology. These are sort of cosmopolitan, well-educated, intelligent users, pro-Western, friendly to democracy. And a lot of assumptions are being made, I would argue, about who they are and what they stand for, the cosmopolitan nature, as opposed to the sort of neo-Luddite people entrenched in power, who are sort of anti-technological. They hate the West, they hate progress. But actually, if you look at Iran as an example, there's plenty of evidence from Iran just how technologically savvy the administration is in that country. So this argument about sort of cosmopolitanism versus sort of backward, nomadic, sedentary groups who are anti-technological and are against progress, it doesn't really hold up in practice when you look at the actual users. And then you take that group and you compare them also to the users outside the country. Like, who are the people using this technology? What are they saying about these events? How are they saying it? And what kind of prejudices or ideas are they superimposing on these discussions that take place in relatively short periods of time? And that's the sort of thrust of the proposal that I had in. So any comments afterward for suggestions about this idea are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.